Previously on Back to Basics, we learned about green stuff and cure stages. Hopefully that video was helpful for you, and hopefully you've got some time with green stuff by now. If you do, you've probably found that some things are a bit easier to sculpt than others. Here's a list of things that I found most difficult as I've been learning green stuff. Blending. Making smooth transitions between green stuff modifications and the host material can be challenging. Green stuff is elastic and rubbery, and while this does help in some ways, it can also make getting a smooth transition quite difficult. It's possible, of course, with the right timing and tools. You can blend green stuff to a degree most people would be happy with, but still, this amount of extra work and polishing throughout the cure stages can be a pain. Carving. Since green stuff is so pliable and bendy, it's not great if you want to carve some sharp edges into it once it cures, especially if the stock is thin. It also doesn't sand very well. This is why we didn't use green stuff to make our pauldron in our shoulder making video. It's just not great for this sort of task. Sharp edges. In addition to carving, green stuff doesn't easily take sharp corners when you sculpt it either. Armor plates and other sharp, clean edges are difficult to achieve since green stuff seems to love to wilt and sag when it cures. This also makes flowing, suspended cloth very difficult to achieve. Either the details poke through and you can see them through the green stuff, or the green stuff doesn't support itself when you want to make dynamic effects. Structural pinning is also difficult. Green stuff doesn't make a very good bolstering material. If you try and drill and pin into it, then support it with another piece, you're going to find that piece is pretty unstable when you're finished. Now all these issues can be worked around, either by changing your mix of ratio with yellow and green, or using the right tool, or waiting for long enough. In fact, many pro artists just accept these limitations and learn to work with them. Some never actually find it necessary to use anything else. But if you've tried green stuff before and you find any of the previous points are a pain for you, let me introduce you to Milliput. Milliput is a two-part material just like green stuff. However, that's where the similarities end. Milliput is the inverse to green stuff in almost every way. First, it's clay-like instead of rubbery. It hardens like a rock and can be sanded and carved like unbaked ceramics. Those of you who have been around the Patreon tutorials have already seen this medium and know that I have some very specific uses for it. It's not better than green stuff. In fact, I find green stuff is easier to use and far more versatile. But because it's so opposite to green stuff, that makes it the ideal, specialized choice to get jobs done that green stuff struggles with. On the Patreon, we've also talked about how to make armor plates, angular apexes, and pauldrons. All of these things are easier to achieve with Milliput than green stuff if we want crisp, sharp edges. We've also seen that blending is so much easier. If you want smooth transitions between your sculpting and the host mini, Milliput is much easier to do in its clay-like composition. In the Marneus Calgar rebuild, we used Milliput to fill the torso cavity. This is because later we needed to anchor the limbs into that cavity by drilling and pinning, and if we had used green stuff with those limbs, they never would have been stable. But it's not like Milliput doesn't have its downsides. Like I said, green stuff is easier to use and more versatile. In fact, I'd suggest that green stuff's downsides are fewer and can be worked around, while Milliput has hard downsides that really make it specialized. Therefore, if you can only have one, just stick with green stuff. Milliput is kind of like cranberry juice. It's okay by itself, but it's great if you add it to something else. And that's where green put comes in. When we combine green stuff and Milliput, we cancel out the many disadvantages of the two and are left with a super medium far more capable than either of its ingredients. When you blend, the Milliput allows for clean and easy transitions, while the green stuff keeps it from falling apart. You can use it for supports and drilling and pinning. You can carve it and sand it, and it supports itself when you draw it out into thin sheets. This means cloth can be thinner and more realistic, and since it cures faster than green stuff alone, you don't have to babysit it for 2 hours just to get the shape you want. To demonstrate the benefits of green put, we are going to sculpt up some complex cloth examples for you guys. Now, this is not going to be a tutorial on how to sculpt complex cloth. If you would like to learn how to do that, that is available on the Patreon. So if you're a patron, go watch that video and come back. And if you are not a patron, go subscribe to Patreon and then come back. We can wait here awkwardly until you do. So to start off, how do we add Milliput to our green stuff? Very simply, we just take 50-50 green stuff and we mix up some 50-50 Milliput. It's really that easy. Don't overthink it, guys. If you're having a hard time getting the ratios right, just mix them up separately and mix them together after you're sure you got 50-50. Like that. So here we have two Space Marine bodies, and I am going to sculpt over the top of them. So here we have a ball of each. This is that 50-50 green put hybrid. This is just 50-50 green stuff. We're gonna roll these out. We'll do the hybrid first. One thing that you will notice straight off the bat, if you have ever messed with green stuff and then you try hybrid, is that the hybrid spreads and flattens easier. It's like clay. It's got the consistency from the Milliput, right? So it's actually easier to spread out, which is really nice. We get to green stuff, especially if the green stuff is cold. Man, this stuff can be resistant to spreading out. You have to press harder. It doesn't like it. Okay. Now, let's apply some of this to our miniature and create our substructure. Let's just grab a piece. You'll also notice that green stuff and Milliput hybrid doesn't stick to your fingers as much, and it doesn't stick to your tools as much, which is really nice. And it also spreads nice and easy. See that? We are almost already done with this substructure application. I don't really need oil on here, see? Because the green put hybrid doesn't stick to your tools nearly as much as regular green stuff. So I'm going to just accommodate this a little bit, or situate it, just kind of down in here, and we'll have it down like that. Not hugely important at this stage, we're just building that substructure. Okay, that's it. That's it for the substructure. Now let's do green stuff. Right off the bat, green stuff also tends to have more bubbles for some reason. Green stuff needs to be a bit thicker than the Milliput, because once it cures, it's going to be flexible and bendy and rubbery, which means we can't press against it to build those folds. So I'm going to press this just in here and see how it sticks to my thumb. It does not want to go on the miniature, and it does not spread as easily as the hybrid. Basically, at every step, hybrid is easier to work with. Trim this out. And I'm going to have to switch to other tools to press this green stuff into place. Now you could get around this by using a little bit more yellow than blue in your mixture. If you used a little bit more yellow, it would be softer and a little bit easier to use. But then you have to remember to do that. And then you can't use that mixture for just anything, right? So if I have all of this extra green stuff here, and it's a certain mixture like 60-40 or even 70-30, and I want to use this for some other detail, it might not be viable for that. It might not be good for that. It might only be good for what I originally wanted to use it for. But hybrid tends to be more versatile. Now once you have your foundation in place, you're going to want to trim, right, some of this out, just kind of shape your cloth. You see how the green stuff just sticks to every damn thing? It sticks to your tools, it sticks to your knife, and that's why I use oil, right? That's why I tell you guys to use oil. But then you gotta be careful not to use too much, use too little, right? It's just a pain. Look, I want to trim this up and it just spreads everywhere. It just wants to stick to itself and everything else. Green stuff can be very messy. Hybrid, on the other hand, is pretty darn easy. Okay, watch. See this? Boop. Removed. Let's go the other way. Boop. Removed. Doesn't stick overly much. It separates, and that's because Milliput overly separates. Milliput will crumble and fall apart and get crummy on you unless you keep it wet with oil. So the combination of green stuff being too clingy and Milliput being too crumbly means that it is just right. See, look at that. I can just scoop that out nice and clean, just like that. Really nice. Now I've got my two examples here curing, and I've started to use the extra green put hybrid on a couple other marines that I'm working on. Even the ones that I started using the normal green stuff on, I switched over to the hybrid because I'm now at about an hour cure time, and I am far past the time where green stuff is ideal for attaching and sculpting deep detail like this stomach cloth, okay? That is another advantage that the Milliput green stuff, or the hybrid green stuff, has, is that it seems to stay pliable longer and still have the ability to stick to your miniature, to attach to it, and yet it still doesn't stick to your tools. It's crazy. It's like this stuff just knows what you need it to do, and it just does it. It is phenomenal. Now that our stuff has hardened, we can examine trimming and cutting. When you do cloth, there's many times where you want to clean it up before moving on to the next stage. This is not terribly difficult, but depending on the thickness of your green stuff, it can be a little bit tricky. So here I have an example of simple cloth, right? Very thin, very, very simple, right? Now, the benefits of this cloth is it's realistic and it's fairly easy to do. But one of the tricky things of it is waiting until the green stuff is cured enough so that when you apply the green stuff, you don't have details like this poking through too terribly. See, green stuff, because it's rubbery and it droops and relaxes, tends to ease down on top of the miniature, and then you have details poking through. You can cover this up with subsequent layers and sculpt them in, blend them in, but the problem is green stuff, if it's thin like this simple cloth, like it should be, it's really hard to sculpt on top of this, because look how much flex there is. If I try to put some more green stuff on top of this, it's not going to act as a good backer. I really need to get a good blend by pressing hard and polishing, right? The only way to do that is if I stick my finger through here, and this is just lucky that I can get a finger in there. Most of the time you wouldn't be able to do that, and so this is not ideal for blending out those mistakes. So that can be kind of tricky. However, if you have hybrid green put, you can go thin, but you can press against it. See how rigid that is? So I can sculpt corrections and extra layers, and if I'm doing complex cloth, I can do folds and details on top of this, no problem. Let me give you an example of that. Here I have a trench coat that I am sculpting, and you can see that the material is really thin. Thin enough that the detail underneath has started to print through. You can see that? Now that's something that I want to cover up. But if I had used green stuff, this first layer would be super flexible and would not let me sculpt on top of it. Now we can take a little bit of green put, we can lay it over the top, and if I wanted to do complex cloth and do folds, and I could do pockets and I could do other details, that is also possible because, again, this is so rigid and it will let me sculpt on top of it. So again, not something you can really do with just regular green stuff, and certainly not something that you can do with Milliput. See that? See how easy I can just blend in another layer on top? So if I wanted to add some more buttonholes, and I forgot to, I could add some more holes down the side here, just adding another thin layer. See that? I'll just get rid of that bump. And a common problem when sculpting cloth that the detail underneath shows through is now not a problem at all. If I were to do complex cloth with green stuff, to see how this is a little bit thicker, I can still press against this, but because it's moving and such, anytime I add another layer on top of this, it's going to be wiggling. So that makes it difficult, which is why with green stuff, doing complex cloth, you have to go thicker and then trim it down. Remember to go watch those videos. The tutorial for simple cloth is available on YouTube, and to the patrons, of course, and complex cloth like this is available only on Patreon. So the next advantage I want to talk about is cutting and trimming. Let's take our knife here and pretend that we want to trim up the bottom of this cloth, right? With hybrid, it is super easy to just take a sharp knife and to just trim that up, clean it. If we wanted to slim down some detail, we can totally do that really easily. Just like that. Let me zoom you guys in. And so it's very, very easy. So say that I did this as simple cloth and then I decided, no, I'm going to do this as complex, which means I need to add folds and layers, right? So I'm going to start adding some on top of this. I probably would want to thin this down a little bit so that subsequent layers don't thicken it up too much, right? And by doing that, it will look a lot better, but removing some of that material can be difficult unless you're using hybrid. See how easy that comes off? See how easy that is to trim? I just set my knife blade along there and it will just come off nice and easy. Just like that. If I have simple cloth and just green stuff, trimming the bottom of this, see how it moves? I mean, it's not impossible. Again, it's not. You can learn to work around these sort of things, but man, is it a pain. So if you make mistakes, a lot of times you got to start over. And if I wanted to, again, add loops folds and details on top of this, it's going to be a real pain. So trimming in this final stage is also easier with the hybrid. Here's another example of the green stuff, right? So I can trim this down, but because this is still so sticky and so rubbery, even though it's completely cured, it tends to grab my tool and can rip itself free of its anchoring to this plastic. So if I'm not careful and I don't have a sharp knife with a little bit of oil, this can easily grab and hold onto my knife blade and it can dislodge itself. Now that we got our host miniatures trimmed up, I want to showcase the greatest benefit of hybrid over green stuff, and that is blending. We're going to add some folds to the cloth. We're also going to add some apexing, I think, to one of the feet so you can see the difference. Let's start with the regular green stuff. Now the idea here is we're going to add this cloth so that we can add some folds, right? So because it's so sticky, you kind of have to really be confident of where you're putting it, because once it's on there, it's hard to move it off. Okay. Now you see where the new green stuff meets the old green stuff. There's this lip. We're going to blend that in. Here's the difficult part that I think a lot of people have run into. Green stuff, because it's so rubbery and it likes to stick to itself more than anything, sometimes has a hard time blending easily. No matter how hard you press it, it's still going to have a line there, right? And so you grab some oil and you really polish it in there. And you can achieve it, but you really got to work this. And I am pressing very hard, which means that you have to have your sublayer very thick and then trim it down. So you see how many different stages there are? Go watch the tutorial for the complex cloth again, if you don't know what I mean. But there are a lot of steps for preparation to get this to work with just straight up green stuff. See, that can blend, but you see how there's still that line there? Just have to polish it out, and your best bet is actually to draw your new stuff all the way to the edge of the old stuff.
so that you can kind of hide your line. So it is doable, but it is a lot of work. Now let's do a little bit of apexing. We'll put it over the foot there. And by apexing, I mean we're gonna blend in a bit of green stuff to make this look like it has a center ridge, kind of like stylized armor, okay? So what we're doing is we're going to be blending the green stuff to the gray plastic. So what we do is we start from our center line and we just start moving it. Now if you have tried this before, you'll know that this is difficult to hide this line. It's really difficult, which is why in the tutorial we used Milliput, because it just blends so much easier. So no matter how much you polish and polish and polish, it's difficult. My usual solution if I'm using green stuff is to just get a very rigid brush and just keep pressing and polishing, and yet still, no matter what, see that right there? See that line? That is difficult to get rid of. Now, you can achieve it. You can keep polishing, you can get your ball tip pokey and you can just press it until it's really flat. You can use a little bit of liquid green stuff to cover it up. You can also wait till this is cured and then sand it down. And at that point, the paint that you apply for base coating should conceal that line, but it is a task, okay? By contrast, let me show you how easy it is to blend the hybrid stuff. I don't even have to carefully apply this stuff like I did this, because look how smooth it goes on. Just like that. Just add a thin layer, throw it on there, and look at this lip right here. See this? Right there? Watch this. No oil, no nothing. Gone. Easy. Bubbles that you get, no problem. Just pop those. Work them out, gone. You can get much easier detail and lines and folds and blends. It's much softer without a lot of work. If you've seen the apexing video, you know how easy this is going to be. But remember how hard it was to blend regular green stuff? Pretty much done. Okay. Now I can keep working that, and of course I would to shape it, but as far as this blend is concerned, just that easy. So again, you can make green stuff work. Look, I actually worked this one off camera, and I ended up pressing with my rigid brush all the way to this edge here so that it blends. I can't end in the middle of no man's land with green stuff so easily, but with hybrid, with green put, you can end anywhere you need to. It's fantastic. Now you may be getting the impression that Milliput green stuff combination or green put is always the go-to. There's no point in ever using just green stuff or Milliput, which is not the case. So here we have that commissar that I showed earlier, and I have added some decorative rank braids and tassels here on his shoulder. Details like this where the material is rolled really thin and added like this would be very brittle if we added any Milliput to it. So this is actually pure green stuff. This is just 50-50 ratio. And the reason that we use green stuff in this case is that it's flexible, that it bends and it's elastic. So if I were to bump any of these little details after it's cured, it will just bend and should be a lot more durable, right? It's flexible. If you add Milliput to it, it would make it harder and more brittle, and these would tend to snap off instead of being resistant and being elastic. So there is still certainly a place for just basic green stuff. To close up this video, I wanted to take a look at some of the miniatures that I've been sculpting on the side while I've been doing this presentation, what I've been doing with the extra material. So here we have a good example of how you can sand and remove material from dried hybrid. See, this material here has all been sanded out and carved. It's really easy with the hybrid material. This one is that basic thin cloth that I did out of green stuff. Remember how it was super flexible? See that? I was able to get my finger between the knees here, and I was able to sculpt some hybrid on top, which made it rigid, and I was able to add some folds and details. This one, I actually made a mistake and did not add the cloth the way that I wanted to, so I've just started to remove some material here on the side. This is another advantage in that you can scrape with your knife and remove material, and that's pretty difficult to do with green stuff because it's so rubbery. See how easily you can just correct your mistakes even if this is already cured? See that? You just scrape it away almost like ceramic. Here I had some green stuff and I added some hybrid folds because the hybrid, remember, can be really, really thin and still be rigid enough to hold its shape. And so this was added so that it gives it more of a realistic look. It's got some space behind it instead of needing to be built up with just green stuff. Here's another example of that where it was very thin. I just added a little sheet of the hybrid. Now, not all of these are finished, but that's just an example. So I hope that was helpful for you guys. If you are finding green stuff to be difficult to sculpt with, if you're finding it to be a little bit of a challenge to do, cloth especially, or hard angles or anything like that, throw some Milliput in there. I think it will help you guys out quite a bit. Thanks for subscribing. Thanks for your support from the patrons. And if you are not a patron, you should really fix that. If you have any questions, get a hold of me on the Discord, or you can message me on Instagram or an email at lastlightcreative@gmail.com. Thanks so much, guys.